Hello, everyone. I'm Chloe Austin, the Exhibitions and Research Manager at Maximillian William London, and I'd like to welcome our speakers and everyone watching to tonight's talk. This talk is in conjunction with Modal Painting, an exhibition of abstract painting, which has been curated by one of tonight's speakers, Oscar Wollheim. Please allow me to briefly introduce tonight's speakers. Reginald Sylvester II is a New York-based artist who works for the most part in abstraction. His large-scale abstractions are equally rooted in social realities, the artist's spiritual practice, and his preoccupation with the medium of paint and its formal properties. Sylvester's faith compels him to approach painting as a means to manifest knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, a belief often hinted at in his evocative titles. Sylvester's work is held in the following public collections: Spazio 1, Lugano, Fondazione Stelline, Milan, and the Wolverhampton Art Gallery. In 2021, Sylvester will be returning to the gallery for his second solo presentation, titled With the End in Mind. Ben Bowling is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at King's College London. He also assists his father, Sir Frank Bowling, in his studio. He has a great knowledge of Sir Frank's process in the studio, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot about tonight. Sir Frank Bowling's career has spanned 6 decades, over which he has consistently innovated through paint. In 2019, he was the subject of a retrospective at Tate Britain, and he has an upcoming exhibition at the Arnold Feeney in Bristol this summer. And Oscar Wollheim is a London-based artist and curator who has made his curatorial debut with Modal Painting, a group exhibition featuring work from tonight's speaker, Reginald Sylvester II, alongside that of Sir Frank Bowling, OBE RA, Sam Gillian, John Golding, CBE FBA, and John Hoyland RA. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Oscar and the speakers.
Hello, thanks for the intro, Chloe. And thank you to Ben and Reggie for taking the time to join us as well. So I guess I wanted to kind of open this conversation up by talking about process. I think that was a big kind of essential idea in the idea for the show itself, but also I think it's the process is really important to both Frank Bowling and Reggie's practice. I think that in a lot of ways the process is kind of like what it's about. So first I wanted to ask you, Ben, about if you could talk firstly about the kind of the beginnings of a painting. I remember you saying before that Frank normally doesn't have a kind of a preset idea of how a painting will be. It will just be a kind of like the color palette will be arranged, and there'll be maybe some kind of idea of a geometry attached to it. But beyond that, it's kind of similar with Reggie, kind of improvisatory, experimental kind of process as the painting progresses. And if you could talk about the beginnings of it, and then also just give a kind of brief overview of the structure, the basic structure of his process, different points, that would be really great.
Okay, well, thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Chloe and Reggie. It's great to be here. And hello, everybody. I can't see you, but so Frank really starts with a blank canvas, an obvious point, not usually primed, but the first thing that he will do will be to soak the canvas, often with the water in the bottom of a paint bucket, or this particular canvas here, there were 2 pieces together, so the canvas will be rolled out onto the floor, soaked with boiling water, and then some kind of geometry will be imposed, but again in a kind of extemporaneous, kind of experimental and improvised way. So these 2 pieces of canvas, just off square, and what you can see is like a circle of paint squeezed straight from the tube, sitting on top of the wet. So his thing is, he usually talks about wet into wet. So if you could just go back 1 slide, just there we go. So basically what you got here is the soaked canvas with the paint pots themselves thrown, like the paint was thrown, grey paint, and he's sort of thinking about grey paintings at the moment, grey paint with the grey paint pots ending up in the canvas itself. And then the yellow and the red, I think that's cadmium red and cadmium yellow, squeezed straight from the tube. So there's a kind of circle in a square thing going on, and then you can just about make out a diagonals. So if you hit the next slide, please, Chloe, then, so with both of these and the next one, what you can see here is the emergence of a kind of the diagonal, circle in a square, and also a central plane. This is probably day 2 or day 2, I think. So floating on top of the water, and by now it's kind of beginning to cook, and the canvas is being held up by stretcher bars all round. It's creating a kind of, it's about maybe a centimeter deep at its deepest point, with the diagonal squirt of red and yellow, a splash of fluorescent red coming, which is kind of bouncing off the canvas there, and then silver and gold powder paint sprinkled over the top. And so that's a kind of, then it will still sit there and cook for a while. The silver and gold powder paint. Take us back one, please, Chloe. So in addition to the paint, he'll either throw gel himself or order one of his assistants to throw gel into the paint, and also found objects. So Frank's had a number of ill health in the last year, and you can just about make out in this picture, this is a pick line, or it's a thing that basically goes into the chest to give antibiotics. So on leaving hospital, he took all the detritus, all the stuff for taking blood and for measuring diabetes, and this pick line was like, okay, just chuck that in, will you? So that's kind of floating around in all the goo. So yeah, so it continues to cook, and there he is. There's a painting called Swimmers in the background. So basically he's there in control, in command all the time, and there's his wife, Rachel Scott, to the side. And so it's wet into wet, and then these heaters are directed at the wet. He used to leave the heaters on overnight. Obviously that's not such a clever idea these days. So we can probably skip on through another couple of slides and see what we got. Aha, so after, this is probably about day 4, and the canvas, as it is beginning to dry, is then pulled up the wall. And so the dry part is up the wall, and then over the top is poured an entirely new layer. These are kind of experiments in gray, and the blue circle in the middle of the circle turned out that it wasn't fully fixed in place, and that blue thing just eventually, I think in that session, slithered down the canvas. So if we go on to the next one, maybe, I think it's in
there was an entire circle that just kind of disappeared.
It just slithered down, yeah, right. Absolutely. And then when the canvas is on the wall, what he'll then do there is to order another piece of canvas to be placed underneath with and also soaked. And then as the paint, all acrylic paint, slithers down the canvas, and he's using a squirter all the time, like a sprayer that you might use in the garden. All the paint slithers down the canvas and begins to start making a new work on the floor, which is the beginning of a new painting.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing.
I think these are we're going to go back to some of these elements later and talk about it in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
So I think I'll move on to Reggie now. I think like your process is also really physical and direct, and kind of improvisatory as well. Even though I know, like Ben was saying about Frank, there's kind of an underlying structure. That there's certain methods that play a role that comes back.
Absolutely.
So could you just kind of give an idea of like of some of kind of your major process points. I know that you also work unstretched, and the big part of it is folding the canvas and kind of almost like a stamping process of distributing the mark making as a way to kind of like begin forming the image.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be talking with you, Ben, Oscar as well. Thank you, Chloe, for introducing us. Yeah, you know, I kind of bounce in between kind of two processes as of late, being that one I'll pretty much make on a stretch surface that's already pre-stretched. Then I'll also kind of go back and make works on an unstretched surface. And really kind of a different thing with my hands, kind of the tightening and the loosening of my hands kind of start to separate when I'm working between the two. So for instance, on a stretch surface, you know, I find my mark making to be a little more tight, being that stamping process that you were mentioning, I can't really duplicate that when the canvas is already stretched over. So I'm always bringing in maybe works on paper or blank pieces of paper and kind of, you know, trying to, you know, create that stamping process through that. But with the unstretched canvases, it's all kind of like a bodily motion, because some of the works are really tall, so I'm able to get up on my stools and, you know, maybe unpin it from the top and maybe stamp a wet. It's very great to kind of hear about Frank and his process about wetting the wet, because kind of my relation to that came through, you know, just being impatient, you know, and kind of frustrated with areas of paint not drying. So I would always kind of take a wet area or area that I've compiled a lot of paint on, and I'd stamp it into another part of the canvas. And that's kind of how I have a sense of a mark making or kind of a stamping process, or almost just duplicating previous marks into making new marks. And that builds texture and distortion into the works. And it was kind of cool to kind of see him starting with that circular kind of form of yellow and red, because those two colors are really the basis of my works. After I've you know, gessoed in the canvas, and I've used you know, brushes or the palette knife to basically give the basis of the canvas a color. And most times, as of recently, they've all been kind of these melanated brown, deep browns, bright browns, or kind of saturated surfaces. And that kind of, for me, I felt started to push my relationship or how I related to color in a certain way. But using that red and that yellow, those are always kind of my starting points, because those are the colors I'm most comfortable with. So you can see in some of these images how on a lot of the works, it's the same kind of palette, but because of the original surface, my relationship of how I build those colors and build the texture between those colors and mix those colors, it starts to kind of change a bit.
So it kind of has a starting point in a certain color spectrum, and then it kind of develops as you go on and takes
it kind of
over. Yeah,
because if you know looking at this big blank surface, you know, it kind of can be a little bit intimidating. But then as you kind of start getting lost into the motion of making, you know, you become a little more confident and a little more unconscious, and you kind of just trust, you know, for me, I kind of just started to trust myself and kind of just let the moment take me into going into the picture. Yeah. So for some of these, it's like, you know, this green work and this pink work, those are paintings that where I painted unstretched and then stretched them. And then if you look to the left, that's a piece of a triptych that I did. That's all on a stretched surface. So I don't know if you can kind of really see a difference, but I'm always kind of bouncing in between.
There's a kind of, yeah, I think there's a kind of textural difference between them, and one is much more like kind of tactile, and the other is more maybe like kind of stroke related, you know, more like a kind of brush related mark making. I think kind of moving on from the starting points of both of Reggie and Frank's kind of the starting point of the painting, I think one really interesting element that I'd noticed in Frank's paintings before, but it was really great to hear Ben's insight in this when we've spoken about it recently, which I think you referred to it, Ben, as Marouflage. I think that was the word you used. And it's kind of like Ben will talk about it in more detail, but it's a kind of a bordering and edging. And I was interested in the way that this kind of came about as like a logistical, pragmatic solution to the issue that because he was using so much gel, that it was just kind of impossible to stretch, basically. So by adding this kind of excess fabric, and then you could, I mean, you can correct me if I got that wrong, but this seems also like a kind of a finishing process of the painting in a way as well. It kind of it frames it both like formally and kind of in terms of the time span of the process.
Yes.
So yeah, I just could you talk a bit on that kind of?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
on that.
Happy to. Maybe Chloe, could you go back 1 or 2 slides? Maybe just one more. Maybe one more before that. Okay, so basically what's happening is as the canvas is kind of cooking on the floor and the details are emerging, so what he's then starting to do is look at kind of finishing touches. So although all of the bulk of the paint is acrylic, and that could be, you know, fine art acrylic paints, but also house paint. And, you know, for Frank, the subject matter of painting is paint. Even though there is the figure, there is landscape, there is, so if you like, substantive subject matter, for him, the subject is paint. What he's trying to do is express ideas, thoughts in the language of paint, interested in color and the way the colors mix together. So in these 2 images, you can just see the kind of picking out of certain details. This is the pick line again, covered in spiders and these kind of drips of cadmium red. So the next slide, I think, is as the painting is going further up the wall. So it's getting towards dry now with this industrial heater on it. So Oscar, yes, the issue of the Marouflage. So this, I should really have the exact date in mind, sometime in the 1980s. In stretching the canvases, he found that there wasn't enough grip on the edge to pull the canvas around the stretcher bar without losing some of the picture plane itself. And so he began to use Marouflage, which is just, you know, it's, I guess, the art world, you know, borrowing French words for various different things. It's either cotton duck canvas or sometimes pre-dyed lighter canvas, usually painted especially, is then cut into strips, placed behind the main canvas, and then glued and stapled directly into the wall. And that's usually done by Frank's wife, Rachel. She's, you know, I think the next slide shows Rachel actually doing the work. So as it's going up, and then once the stapling is done, he'll then choose a color of chalk. Certainly at the moment, it's his practice. And then the seam between the main canvas and the Marouflage is then chalked round, and then gel over the top of that, and then ammonia. I could have said a lot more about ammonia earlier in the process. It's an occupational hazard of being in Frank's studio, that you're dealing with this industrial strength ammonia, which is, it's a pretty heady stuff, especially for an 87-year-old. And then that's kind of that, as you say, it's a framing device. It grew out of a necessity for stretching. And now it's really become a feature of the work. So there'll either be 4 or 5 inch Marouflage, and then once it's stretched, you probably get about an inch that you can see once the painting is stretched.
They're still on the front of the canvas.
They're still on
yeah,
exactly. So it's going around the sides, but you usually get like a bordering.
So it's kind of like a peripheral kind of color element.
Yeah, and the choice of Marouflage is a kind of discussion that Frank will have in his head, an idea, and then he'll choose something. Sometimes it's the same color. Sometimes there'll be 3 or 4, you know, different. Sometimes there'll be a patchwork of colors, and they all somehow manage to pick out something in the painting. Like
Yeah.
this arachnophilia here is the name of this particular work. It has the green, the brown, and the blue, which are picking out elements of the work. And then one final point about kind of finishing is varnish. Like, you know, I'm a criminologist, not an art historian or an artist, but I have been educated a little bit in the ways of varnishing. So Frank uses a mixture of elvasite, natural turpentine, beeswax, and sometimes pearlescent powder, or even sometimes like a tincture of oil paint into the varnish. Each work will probably have 2 or 3 layers of varnish sometimes. The pearlescence will be so intense that it'll actually kind of push back the colors, almost like a kind of a layer of kind of pearlescent gray over the entire canvas. And then they'll kind of get to a point where he'll say, okay, it's done. We'll come back perhaps overnight and it'll be rolled up to be stretched. Then when it comes back in, the danger is that he'll start working on it again.
So there is working into it stretched as well.
Often working into it stretched, spray varnish, or a bit of extra beeswax, or another wash of a coloured varnish. And you know, this idea of the vernissage, you know, the varnishing day. So I have this picture in my mind now of these Victorian masters coming into the Royal Academy, or, you know, wherever it was, with their pots of varnish and their oil paints, and adding things in. You know, it's actually much more of a finishing process, quite a complex finishing process. Apparently there's a whole science and art history of varnish. Like, you know, all you nerdy people out there, go for it.
So it's not even just a technical element. It's a kind of like, it literally is the finishing process in terms of like, you're making the image how it will stay, basically, how it will live beyond that.
Yeah, but actually not stay. I think Frank thinks of the works as almost like living things. And so conservators will say things like, you know, if you use that particular kind of varnish, it'll yellow. And he'll say, yeah, and?
It's a constantly evolving shift. It makes a lot of sense when you look at his whole process and kind of the way he works. And so kind of moving on from the idea of the way Frank uses Marouflage, I wondered, Reggie, as we just spoke about, the work you do is kind of split between unstretched paintings and stretched paintings. But a lot of it goes on unstretched. And I was wondering if you could kind of like, because obviously there's almost divide it into the process. There'll be making the painting unstretched, and then like with Frank, there'll be the moment once it's stretched and almost becomes a kind of, not, as we were just saying, not finished or stuck necessarily, but it becomes kind of a different type of object. So I just wonder if you could talk on the idea of finishing and stretching, and how that maybe, where that element ties up with like the final image, and how you view that.
Well, yeah, I feel like since I've been able to have this studio I've had for the last like 3 years, I've been able to live with the work a lot longer. So it's definitely been moments of me making, I was so used to at one point of just making everything in one sitting, right? You just hash out an image and you say it's done and you walk away. But with this studio, it's been really healthy for me to kind of make work, leave the studio. It might be partially done. It could be considered done in that moment. And then I'll come back and kind of live with the work in a way and make the decision where I wanted to either add or change, or then end up saying, okay, this is a finished piece. Let me stretch it. But on the finishings, what I started to feeling like is that the paintings I felt like needed something more, and something more than just texture, color, and energy and all the things that make up abstract pictures, but wanted to kind of like make these things kind of feel like these, I don't know, these objects or memorializing these paintings. And so that's when I started looking around the studio and thinking about the leftovers and the remnants of what's laying around, whether that's leftover canvas that I haven't used because I've cut it from a roll, or the threading from tearing the canvas, and being left with a lot of that and feeling like, oh, how can I kind of look at my mark making or look at these leftover materials and kind of re-implement them into the work to kind of create something new, or just do something that I've never done before. And so where the photo's at now with the threading that's left over from the canvas, I just had so much of it left over. And I started thinking about, interesting ways and to use it. And so at first I was just kind of like, taking paint and putting it on one end and kind of just like, putting it on one part of the canvas. And I would have this kind of wild, I have a big heater in my studio and the air would blow through, and I'd be, the painting can have to kind of be in a sense of what Frank is talking about, is like, or what you're saying about Frank, is the work can kind of be alive. So the wind kind of would blow in the studio, and I would have these elements of the painting that when the wind blows, it moves. And it kind of made me think about these paintings having like this live element, even thinking about it in a space where, somebody opens the door and a gust of wind comes through and they maybe look at the work and, it's a part of it that moves. So that really intrigued me. And then I got a little more confident and I just started draping the top of the canvases with more and more of it. And kind of some, maybe the swinging and the mark making that I would do, and some of those attributes, I would kind of try to reflect that with the drapings. And then Chloe, if you keep scrolling, I wonder if there's an image of, this is, you can go back one, where it was like a little black piece of canvas on the surface. Yep, right there. And even with this is, just having a lot of just debris and things, just finding ways to add to the surface and add to the canvas. So even moments like this, there'll be some part of a canvas that I, left over from another thing that I might have stretched, and just kind of adding those things. And what I come to find, it just makes these paintings feel more than just like paintings. They really start to kind of feel like objects hanging on the wall. And that really excites me about a picture. What more, what can I add, or what can I contribute, or what can I use to memorialize these images and make them more than just, a painting, a painter's painting, or a painting.
Yeah, I think it really does add another dimension. I think that speaks really well to both your practice and also to Frank's. There was a couple really interesting things that came up there. And one is like the idea that it makes it something kind of changeable, because a detail that I was interested to be part of is when the painting that's in Modal Painting, the show, came over, it was one of your earliest paintings using string, which, like you said, was like it was actually string that was fraying off the edge of the canvas. And so as you said, you must have like noticed it kind of hanging off, and then decided to make it part of the painting just by tacking it on with wet paint. But what was interesting is that the kind of in a way that it was different before it left the studio to after, because obviously the string shifted a bit, and part of the conversation in installing was actually adjusting the string in a way that you were kind of like happy with. So, but that's something that's inevitably always something that's going to change. So it does kind of bring in like a funny element to the work. But what you've spoken about there is really naturally led on to kind of, I think, quite a big point in terms of the process of both Reggie's work and Frank's work. Is this kind of like firstly, I guess it's the role of the studio. It's the studio becoming part of the work and becoming part of the process. But also it comes down to kind of use of detritus and waste and debris. And you spoke about it a bit just then, Reggie. And I know that that's a big part of Frank's process as well, Ben. And you touched on it when you were kind of like giving us an overview of some elements of his process just then. But specifically, things like he'll squirt water at a painting which has another canvas attached on the floor, like perpendicular below. so that as the excess paint floods into this canvas, it becomes almost a starting point of another painting. And some other things that really caught my attention that you said were things like, just scraping the kind of like settle paint off the bottom of the bucket that's used to clean brushes and applying that. So, everything goes into the paintings basically. Like if kind of a hard bit of resin falls off, he'll ask you to put that back on. So yeah, could you just speak a bit about that whole kind of like recyclable
Yes.
kind of ongoing process where everything becomes part of,
Yeah.
Speak on that.
So I think part of it is, Frank, born 1934, a kind of, growing up in what was then British Guyana. Waste is like a sin. So nothing gets wasted in the studio, not a drop of paint. If any of the paint dribbles on the floor, he gets very frustrated about that. Even the thinnest of paint, if there's material there, he wants it all to be used, everything to be used. In the last few weeks, there's been a kind of an interlude, having just finished a very large work, and we rolled out some kind of canvases that hadn't really worked from a decade ago, and he started painting over them. So there's a red, a blue, a green, and a yellow, and they are, these are kind of monochrome paintings, but they're painted over deeply textured and colorful paintings. So he has this idea, a word I'd not heard until we started talking about this, palimpsest. It's a kind of process of erasure. It comes from ancient texts. You're scrubbing something out, erasing something, and yet the residue of what's gone before is still visible. So that's going on. So the buildup of layers, and then, so everything gets used. I think the practice of putting found objects in probably goes back to the 1980s. Frank's always had people in the studio, his sons, his stepdaughters, other family members and friends. Anybody who comes by gets involved.
They kind of leave their mark in one way or another.
Leave their mark, or he might say, like, oh, those are interesting, bits of kind of costume jewelry, just chuck them into the paintings. Or it might be bits of rubbish, bits of glitter, so there is a question about what is like rubbish from the studio. Like, sometimes used staples will end up in the, so is that like a flaw that needs to be taken out, or is that an integral part of the work? And just picking up on what Reggie said a moment ago, Frank also uses string that's come off the edge of the cotton duck that gets pulled into the canvas. He will use gel to pin it down. There is a story about a work made in the 70s, the matte painting, that had a piece of cotton duck dangling from it. A collector saw this, thought that's kind of a bit untidy, and snipped it off. They snipped it off.
Oh wow!
Oh, too late.
Oh, no.
But I think, I was interested in Reggie, you talking about this, the stuff that ends up on your canvas. It seems quite sort of like it's telling a story. There's do you see it as the paintings as autobiographical? Do they somehow, are they like a kind of a diary of the work, the time in the studio?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because for me, they're about the thoughts that I'm thinking. And a lot of the times when I'm making the work, I'm thinking about what's going on in the world, especially with our people, the suffering, oppression. And so I don't know if Chloe, you'll be able to, I don't know if you still have some of those images of the bondage paintings, but what that string kind of led me to was kind of have an intention behind what I'm adding, or the debris that I'm adding, or the leftovers in. And so I ended up thinking about, I think I wanted to drape, I made a bigger painting and I wanted to do heavier drapes and I couldn't do it. So I went out and bought rope. And the rope, that was the first time when I started to try to really take this kind of idea that came from just leftovers and kind of bring a narrative into it, and started making these bondage paintings with pretty much, I would make a finished work and then I'd start wrapping it or draping the canvas with the rope in a certain type of way. And so I guess in a sense, that's the first time I really kind of had that thought, like, they're okay, you know, these things that I'm doing after the work is finished, what, how is this work being memorialized, or what way in which it's being memorialized, and what are these extra elements saying? And so the maybe not so more the drapes, because that's more attached to just the process and what's left over from the actual canvas, but with the bondage paintings, that is specifically speaking about, kind of us, the paintings for me without the rope are just spiritual paintings. I feel like they're like a reflection of my own spiritual battles and the spiritual battles maybe we all go through out in the world. But then these bondages that I'm kind of applying to the surfaces is kind of speaking about how, in some ways, not just physically being still kind of oppressed or held down in a sense, but also spiritually too.
I think that's really interesting. I think that it's an example of a way, almost like a kind of improvisatory aspect of the process can kind of take on more meaning, and you've almost taken out like a kind of another element of meaning in the painting that's come out kind of like incidentally almost, and then obviously it's become an intentional thing. And then obviously it makes me think, you talked before about distortion, and in a way, like adding a string to the painting after is kind of like an intervention in it. Mm-hmm. And in some way that's kind of something kind of like ugly about that. And I think that I can see how that speaks to a lot of kind of like distortion that exists in the world now. I mean, it's visible now, but obviously it's always been this, that kind of, it's like bringing an element of distortion to the painting.
And I also too, I think about like the history of just like, Black and brown people alike, or at least thinking about my family, we're so used to kind of coming up and making the best out of nothing, or making something out of nothing. And I've always kind of thought about kind of that mindset. It's like, or through like slavery, we would get the leftovers, and that's how maybe like chitlins were made, or like, frog legs in the South, or pig's feet and things like that. And so I always kind of like felt, when I started to do it and kind of had it at mind, I kind of was like, man, I'm kind of speaking into my lineage, a bit by, it's not about maybe buying this thing or getting this thing, or even hearing Ben, you speak about Frank. He's not going out to get these things. He's looking around him. He's like, there's so much history and storytelling within the studio. How can I take those leftovers and like put those back into the work? And so I kind of naturally found myself getting into that space as of late, really, the end of last year, or even the end of COVID, or the first lockdown in COVID. And so, I kind of would, that gave me a lot of strength in going into the studio and looking at, what's around here, or, what can I take from my environment to make these works feel something more.
Reggie, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I definitely get the connection between food and painting. Frank's, what he, the kind of food that he eats, he likes pig's trotters and ham hock, kidneys, tripe, buck tripe, and together with okra and fresh vegetables, and and it takes time to cook. And it's like all the ingredients are kind of relatively commonplace on their own, and often leftovers, but as they cook, as they kind of emerge, they become something changes. And when you look at that painting, Arachnophilia, by the time you get to the end of it, the things that you started with, the ingredients, like a big chunk of meat or some vegetables or whatever, and some stock, you put into the slow cook pot. And what you end up with, like, the Guyanese pepper pot, like certain things that you actually, like cassia reap, you can't eat it, to begin with, because it's poisonous. And that is what breaks down all the sinews in the meat. It only makes sense as food with it, after cooking for 3 days. Similarly, it only kind of makes sense as a painting when the whole thing has been cooked and basted and
Yes, sir.
boiled slowly over time. So yeah, maybe it's like painting as soul food.
Yeah,
Yeah.
painting as soul food.
I think we've got a few minutes left before we're going to go to Q&A, I think, but just to touch on the thing about cooking you're talking about there, Ben, and something I wanted to bring up quickly before we finish the conversation, is that there's almost kind of an alchemical element to that thing as well, allowing things to stew and then literally like almost like a chemical reaction going on, which changes the painting as it goes along.
Yeah. I'd like to pick up on that if I could, because I don't know whether, Chloe, you can find the images of the spiders on the surface of Arachnophilia. I mean, they are definitely spiders, and you've got the pick line, but they've evolved. They've turned into, there we go. Yeah, that one and the following one. So the alchemical thing is like there's gold powder paint in here, but when it touches ammonia, it goes blue. And you've got gel, and this sort of, it's kind of become one thing. It's like and also the previous slide, it's kind of, everything has kind of fused together into something kind of new. It also does link to the conversation we had previously about jazz. There's a structure, there's a geometry, there's a palette, there's materials, but then there's improvisation, which somehow pulls everything together to create some kind of complex unity.
Yeah, it's almost a kind of like foundational and then auxiliary kind of these elements to interact with each other. So I think.
By the way, Ben, that was my bad, Oscar. I just want to say that was a bar. Painting as soul food. That's a whole thing right there. That's a whole bar. I love that.
Okay, we'll do it. It's a spin-off, right? It's got to be in New York.
Okay. Hey, I'm just jumping back in. I think I totally agree. Painting as soul food, I think, is maybe the I don't know, just the quote of this whole talk.
Done.
But if it's all right with you guys, can we go into a few questions?
Of course.
Okay, so I have one that I think actually links quite nicely into what you were talking about with modal jazz. Oscar, would you be able to speak on how you conceptualize modal painting?
So it was a quite a complex idea in some ways, but really I want to say that it was a kind of like a framework to not only to bring these artists together, but also to look at abstract painting from a perspective like we've been talking about of kind of like the process and what forms an abstract painting. So it's kind of like maybe elements of memory, elements of light, elements of the actual process and how kind of a process is used in order to express different modes, where those modes relate to like light or nature or something kind of emotional, psychological, like some of the things we've spoken about as well. And Ben just brought up jazz at the end there, and although it's not where the kind of the phrase came from, it's not where I took that from. It was always something that I didn't want it to be like a direct thing, but it was something I had in mind in relation to modal jazz, which was quite a specific moment in jazz at which it began to kind of open out and introduce more like discord and atonal elements, like we see a lot in both Frank and Reggie's use of color, and the idea of kind of like improvising around the basic structure, and also the modal element was that it was the kind of like particular type of scale which was less rigid than a kind of than a normal scale. So it meant there was kind of like each mode almost reflected a particular feeling. I think that was like an idea that I thought was a valuable way to maybe look at abstract painting from a certain perspective. So yeah, I mean, it's something as we've seen here, there's a lot of connections, and we can talk about all these different kind of relationships. You could go on and on, but I hope that's some kind of insight.
Yeah, this is a great introduction. Sorry, I'm just aware we have quite a few questions. We only got about 13 minutes left. If people could put their questions in the Q&A, it just makes it a bit easier for me to find them. So the next question is really interesting to hear about processes and relationships between the way you use materials and your interest and cultural background. There's lots of improvisation in your process. How aware are you of the subject matter before the paint touches the canvas? What is the planning process like for painting? I think that's directed at Reggie.
I'm like reading it. There's a lot of improvisation in your process. How aware are you of the subject matter before the paint touching the canvas? What is the plan? I mean, because these images really, there's no plotting or planning the images. It's really an energy driven, soul driven type of process for myself. You know, I'm making momentum, and so I'll make a certain amount of paintings, and then I won't make any work for a few weeks or for maybe a month or a month and a half, and then I'll go back in. But I think what's important for me is to live with the work and let whatever emotions I'm feeling or thoughts I'm having kind of come out in the painting, and then I kind of come back and sit and kind of I start to maybe title them or think about what they mean or what these paintings stand for. But there's really no kind of planning process, you know. Like I've kind of lately been making some portraits that randomly just happened through being in COVID, maybe not seeing people, and I hadn't, you know. And then when I got back to New York, I was like, I was feeling low on energy or feeling low spiritually or whatever. And then one day, you know, I had the energy, and I went in and I made this huge purple work, which you've probably seen a bit of it in the photos, and those just come. So I really try not to plot pictures. The whole reason why I got into was intrigued about making abstraction was based off of de Kooning and him speaking about finding an image. And so I think you have to put yourself in the conditions in order to make, in order to find, and then you come across images that you might have never ever maybe made before, or maybe didn't think that you could make. If that answers the question.
Yeah. And then now I have one for Ben. Ben, could you share with us how Frank felt working through abstraction coming out of his more figurative period, in the sense of how commitment was important in the journey of painting?
That is a very good question.
Go.
So Frank learned about painting in London, at Chelsea and City and Guilds, and then at the Royal College of Art. Trained as a figurative painter in the painting school under Carol Waite. You know, lots of time in the live class, you know, learning about geometry, learning about the science of color, and figuration, but was always kind of out there breaking the mold. So when the class was given the subject of birthday, his, you know, series of birthday paintings are about the moment of birth. You know, they're quite shocking, actually. There's a lot of work from that period, from the early 60s, about childbirth, abortion, deformity, you know, and I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, his, you know, having mixed race children, where in the 60s in England, a lot of talk about, you know, the deformity that would be the product of unions between black and white people. So I think he was very much focused on, you know, sort of, you know, kind of the more challenging aspects of figuration. But even in those figurative paintings, there's a lot of abstraction in there. And Frank insists that abstract art really begins with the old masters. You know, he'll take you to the National Gallery or to the Tate and say, look at the edges, look at the edges of that Titian, look at what's going on in Turner, particularly late Turner. You know, it's you look at late Turner paintings and they are abstract paintings. But the question about how he felt, I think he felt constrained by the figurative work. And when he moved to New York in 1966, having seen Rothko and Pollock at exhibitions in London. I think the idea of freedom that he was seeing in the color field painters, in abstract expressionism, I think he felt liberated. I think that period between 1966 and say 76 was this kind of anything is possible, particularly the physical space of a Broadway, of a Soho loft. So I think the emotions there are about being schooled in the English figurative and landscape tradition, encountering abstract expressionism, color field, and so on in New York. And it's like a liberation. And at first, his transition, I think, is through the maps and the pause, particularly the maps as a kind of referent, and silk screens of, you know, members of the family, his mother, his sons, family home, mother's house. And then by the, you know, by 72 or 73, even the maps have gone. And I think it was about liberation and a feeling of extraordinary freedom as a painter.
Thank you, Ben. You guys always have such great insights to Frank. Actually, this next question kind of is quite nice because it's a similar question, but this time to Reggie. Is there a difference in the mark making process in the abstracts versus the figurative painting?
No, not really. I mean, I guess with the portraits, I'm more constrained, obviously, because I'm trying to fit it into maybe a face or an eye, but I try and keep that same energy. A lot of the same things I do in the abstractions with the brush, whether I'm using parts of the handle to scratch or the stamping process, I'm still duplicating a lot of those same things. You know, when the picture starts to arrive in the portraits, it starts to feel too clean and too perfect. I gotta destroy it a little bit. I need to mess it up a little bit. And I think that's kind of where I guess the time spent working in abstraction, I can lend some of that energy into the portraits.
Interesting.
Yeah, definitely. You can see it so much in this picture as well. So, and then another one for you, Reggie. I'm curious to know if there's a reason behind the base colors of red and yellow. Did these colors tie into your background experience, or are they simply pleasing to the eye and the work?
Initially, when you said background, I'm like, oh, I love ketchup and mustard on my hot dogs. But what happened was I spent some time in Mexico City, and I was working in a studio that I only could work in from like 8 a.m. to maybe about 5 because I had no lights. I only could work in natural light. And it was my first time using oil paint, and it was the first time that I realized that all the times that I have been making paintings, I have been making from just white gessoed surfaces, and I never made paintings on darker surfaces. And so after making that body of work and coming back into the studio in my home studio in New York, when I picked up kind of those realizations, but going back and using acrylic paint, there's something about the saturation and energy in red and yellow. And maybe, you know, when I think about fire, you know what I mean? You think about those two colors when you see fire or orange, and I think it heats up a painting. You know, it really gives a warming, fiery kind of energy or essence to a work. So I always naturally start with that. You know, after first, you know, covering the surface in a melanated tone. And so yeah, it's been kind of like my safety net the past few months of me making. I always start, and then I kind of try and bring in something. Like in this image, you know, those paintings on the right, there's like blues in there, and I started to feel like, okay, you need to kind of cool the painting down. But yeah, I think when I think of red and yellow, I think of fire, I think of destruction, I think of spirit, I think fire is a spirit, you know, fire is a spirit. I think of those things, and those are kind of the reasons why I always lend myself to those two colors.
And I just want to take us back to one of Frank's paintings. Someone's asked, they've aimed it at Ben, but also I feel like Oscar and Reggie, you probably speak about this painting too a bit, about the painting Plume, which is currently on show alongside your painting, Reggie. So Ben, could you speak briefly on Plume 1978 and its context coming into the end of the Pour painting series?
Yes, it's a very good question from our anonymous attendee. So the pores are really just prior to this painting being made, or this is kind of coming out of the pores, as you've said. Some of the early pores, like Tony's Anvil and Ziff, so the pores were made on a structure where the canvas was tilted, and various colors of paint were poured over the top. And they are quite regular. And actually it's interesting looking at the palette of something like Tony's Anvil in this kind of red, blue, yellow, and white. It's kind of like, it's a kind of Mondrian on acid, you know, it's sort of like, you know, Mondrian kind of melting down the canvas. But these works, which Plume is an example, and there's R. Susan Woosh and Moby Dick from around the same period. He's got the pores, but then he's beginning to do other things with it, starting to move the canvas around in different ways, starting to use a lot more water, and also you can kind of see the beginning of little bits of brushwork happening in there as well. So I think that from about 78, almost by the time we get to the 1980s, then that's when you're looking at lots of foam, packing material. They become almost sculptural. He's just finished a work that has all this stuff called wood wool in it. It's thick packing material, as well as like 3 or 4 buckets of gel. And it's incredibly heavy. It's like he started talking about it like bas relief. Like it's not sculpture exactly, but it's sculpture. I think the Plume is at a point where he's really taking the techniques of pouring, but adding in dripping, stippling, you know, washing, and a whole range of new and different techniques into his armory, which then from then emerge into the 80s paintings, where everything kind of explodes once again. To the point, actually, the 80s paintings, when they were shown at the Serpentine, one critic wrote, "It's not painting, it's something else. It uses paint, but it's not painting. It's something that's different from painting."
That's so beautiful, and actually, that's such a lovely way to end the talk as we're coming up to the end. I don't know if you guys have any final comments before I kind of round us off.
No, yeah, it's a great way to end it.
Yeah, it's not painting, it's something else. Yeah, so thank you. On behalf of the gallery, thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you so much to everyone who's listening in. Thank you to everyone who's asked questions. They were such great questions. This conversation has been recorded, so we'll get it out to you very soon if you want to listen back. And I really hope you all enjoy the rest of your days, and I hope that some of you are able to come and see the paintings in real life in Modal Painting once we reopen on the 12th of April. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much to Chloe and to the gallery and everybody. It's been great.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.